Okay, welcome everyone to TAM Lab number 75. Today we have Brian Wuchner joining us. He's going to be showing us how to leverage the content management capabilities within the vRealize Lifecycle Manager, basically to copy over vRealize operations dashboards from one environment to the next. So pretty excited to have Brian here today. And with that, I will hand it over to Brian and you can take it away.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so I guess just to frame up the presentation for today, what we've got here, I had a customer ask about moving vROps dashboards from one vROps instance to another, right? So this could be a variety of use cases. You might have, data center 1 and data center 2, where each have their own vROps instance, or you could have something like corporate IT and manufacturing division that each have their own separate vSphere and vROps environments, but they want to share dashboards, or anything really kind of like where you end up with more than one vROps instance within an organization. So the problem with sharing dashboards historically has been, you can go into vROps, we could create this dashboard, I could export it and then email that zip file to someone else, they could import it. But you really have no record of change log or anything like that. So as part of the session, we'll also touch on using source control. So the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager can integrate with a couple different source code repositories. So we'll actually connect to one of those. In this demo, it'll be GitLab, but there are a few others that are supported as well. For this demo, we're going to be using vROps 8.1 and LCM 8.1. Those are the latest shipping versions as of today. So that's what we're going to be using for the demo. And like was mentioned earlier, Dale said this is interactive. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to interrupt, use the Q&A or just speak out, and be happy to answer any questions if I can. So to get started, I did want to kind of show some differences in vROps dashboarding, right? So we will end up making a dashboard that we're going to move between environments. But to get started, I want to show one dashboard here that doesn't work and kind of explain why we're going to be making the dashboard the way we will. So right now we're looking at a single vROps instance, and it's got a dashboard that we created that's looking at CPU usage of 2 VMs, and then there on the right there are spark lines, those same 2 VMs, showing CPU and memory usage. So this dashboard was created just by picking those widgets, finding the individual VMs, and then drilling into the metrics that we wanted, and just displaying those individual metrics for those individual VMs. The problem when we move this to a different instance is that those objects may not exist, right? So if the first instance of vROps we were looking at was the corporate IT environment, and the second tab here is the manufacturing environment, they don't have the same inventory, so those VMs aren't going to appear, and so these widgets aren't going to populate data. And so that's I think that's the kind of first part of the problem that we need to solve, is make a vROps dashboard that is portable between environments. That's kind of the foundational piece we're going to need before we start moving things. So if we come back over to this initial vROps manager, we're going to use this as our source environment where we've got a working dashboard. And what we're going to do is create some groupings, some custom groupings that we'll end up using as our dashboards. And then those groups will actually include the VMs that we're interested in, instead of including those objects directly in the dashboard. All right, so if we go into administration, there's this configuration group types. There's a handful of groups that are going to be created automatically just by installing vROps. I want to say department and environment are among those. But for just purposes of of this demo, we're going to create our own categories. And these will actually exist across, or we'll need to create these in every vROps instance where we end up using this dashboard. So that's why we're creating our own group, just so that we kind of have control over it and we're not relying on something that may already been used for a different purpose inside of a vROps instance. So to kind of keep this simple, we will call this TAM Lab 075 group. We'll call it group type, right? Because this is a group type, and using this as kind of our naming convention will just kind of help us when we see it in the future, we'll know where we entered this text. So once we create a group type, we will toggle over to environment, and we will create some custom environments that use that group type. So when we go in here to create a new group, we'll call it TAM Lab 075 domain controllers. And the group type in this drop-down list, we will see that TAM Lab 075 group type that we created earlier. We'll go ahead and check this box to keep our group membership up to date. And then we will say that this group is going to contain virtual machines that have an object name that contains control. And we'll preview this just to make sure it works. And so we see 2 domain controllers. That's exactly what we would expect. So we'll go ahead and say OK to that. And so we've created our first group. And then we'll go ahead and we'll create a second group here, just so we have multiple examples. So again, TAM Lab 075 group type will be the group type. It will contain virtual machines whose object name contains radius. And we'll preview that. Again, there's 2 of them, kind of makes sense. We don't actually have to use this kind of criteria where we're using names that contain specific things. If we wanted to, just go check boxes for a handful of individual VMs, let's say they don't match a naming pattern, or it's just, your 5 most important VMs or something, and you've determined that outside of any sort of naming convention or whatnot, you can just drill in and pick the individual VMs that you want to include. So there's a handful of ways to map to this group criteria. So lots of options. In this case, the name makes the most sense for us, or for this environment, I should say. All right, so now we have two groups there, and let me make sure I can find them here because I only see one of them. All right, there they are. It just was kind of sorting weird. So we've got our 2 groups. We're all set there. So now we'll just toggle over to dashboards, and we'll create a new dashboard that uses those groups as opposed to using kind of manual selection inside these widgets. And to make it even slightly more complicated, it's going to kind of help enforce the demo here in a bit. We'll actually have this dashboard contain a custom view as well. So we'll put a dependency in it that we'll also want to move to our new environment. So we'll create a view, and we'll call this TAM Lab 075 CPU usage. And it will be, let's say, trend view that contains virtual machines. And then we'll go find something like CPU usage as a %. So we'll put that in here. We'll say preview. Let's go look at like maybe just AVM for reference. We'll go pick out one of those domain controller VMs, and we'll just look at it on the chart. And this is just to make sure that the view that we are creating has all of the right properties. So historical data, info in the past, yeah, we want that. Trend of historical data, that dotted line, that's fine. And we'll say we'll forecast just 1 day into the future as opposed to 5 days. And we don't need to really do any of these other roll-ups or set warnings or whatnot. We can, but for purposes of this demo, just having this view out there will be good enough. So we'll refresh that. This looks a little better. We've got more historical data, or more room for historical data and less room for that future trend. So this looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and save that view that we created. And then we'll go create a dashboard. All right, so let's see here. I think I toggle over to views here because I want to use that view I created. And I'll put my trend out here. I guess we should give our dashboard a name before we get too far along. Call it TAM Lab 075 Dashboard 1 because we're super creative. All right, and we'll go through the configuration of this widget. So the self-provider, that's basically asking where the data is coming from. Is it coming from this widget, or is it going to come from somewhere else? And in this case, it's going to come from somewhere else. So it's not a self-provider. And the output data is going to be the name of that view that we created. So we'll just search for TAM Lab 075. There should only be one match, so that'll make it easy. So we'll pick this guy here. That's the one that's selected. It asks us what other items we want to show. The only one here is legend. So basically saying, do we want a legend on this widget? And we do. We're gonna, those two groups that we created, they each had 2 VMs in them. And so this legend will tell us, which color line means which VM. So we'll want to see that legend. All right, so that was that's pretty straightforward. Let's go put another widget on here as well. So let's do. I'm always a fan of that trend line. So let's see if we can find that. Did I skip past it? Anybody else see it? Here, Sparkline, that's what I was looking for. Okay, so we'll put it in. We'll do really roughly the same thing in here as well. Not a self-provider. The output data, we'll go find virtual machine, and we'll go get something like, we'll say CPU ready as a %. Oh, always double click, and I don't need to. We'll do memory usage as well as a %. Okay. So we've got 2 metrics that'll show up in this Spark line as well. But the piece we're missing is where what data is it that we're going to show in here. So what we'll do is take this object list, and then we'll edit the object list. We'll tell it that it is a self-provider. We want it to actually be what selects the data. And then we will go and filter out our custom groups here. So we'll go and say, let's see here. There's 2 ways to do this, and I always fall for doing it the wrong way first. So we see our group type, but we can't actually select the group type. We'd have to pick the two individual groups. So the right way to do this is to actually find, there is a, let me skim through my notes here real quick. See, I thought I wrote this down so I wouldn't fall for it again, but here we are. Let me go find it. There is a, there's like a thing that says group. Once I find it, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes plenty of sense. And apologies for this here. I should have wrote that down. It's not applications. Here we go. Let's go to object types. There we go. All right, that makes more sense, right? So the object type is that group type that we created. So we want to show a list of all of those group types. So when we say save, we should see our domain controllers and our radius servers. So object list, object type, and then we pick the custom group that we created. Now this doesn't really, this isn't working, right? So why is that not working? And the reason is we need to actually tell this dashboard that we want selection over here to actually do stuff to these other two widgets. So we do that in this show interactions view. So we're going to take our object list, and the thing coming out of it is going to drive these other two widgets. So when we say hide interactions, now when we make a selection over here, it should populate stuff over here. So we got 1 for 2. That's not bad odds, but it's not what I expected either. So let's see here. Let's see if the other one works, and if it doesn't, maybe I messed something up on this Spark line. All right, self-provider's off. The output data, virtual machines. Yeah, here, transformation. So it's not the group that we want to see information on, it is the children of the group members, right? So the groups contain virtual machines. We want to see the actual virtual machine, so that would be a child of the group. All right. So I think that's populating the way we would have expected. Apologies for that one detour on figuring out this object list, and those interactions, but I think we're good. All right, so we've got this set the way we want. We've got our dashboard, it's working. We'll go ahead and save it. And so now we've got this one dashboard that is actually controlled by this object list. And we could spend hours talking about how to make a great dashboard. We could either put this object list as the first widget, so it's the first thing we see, or we could drag it off the page if there's only one item in it and we want to only show that first row. We could do many things with it, but for the purposes of this demo, I think we're in good shape, right? Because we've got 2 widgets, and we can rearrange these any way we want. But let me let me just drag them kind of like this. We'll make this one a little bit smaller. We'll make these a little bit bigger. All right, because this is the data we're actually interested in, so we can make these kind of fit a little bit better and make something like this bigger. All right, a little bit easier to see some of that data. I think this is probably a better way of arranging things. But again, we could do any number of things with the dashboard. The real key is using this object list to drive the interactions to these other two widgets. And then for purposes of the lifecycle manager for content, having this trend view that's actually based on a custom view is going to be important here in a second. All right, so enough fun with vROps for now on this source instance. The next step we'll do is go and create some similar groups in our destination vROps environment, right? Because we mentioned that the inside of this dashboard is going to be references to the TAM Lab 075 group type, and it'll display a list of all of the groups that are of that group type. So we need to make sure that that group type and groups that match that criteria exist. So we'll go ahead and do that before we jump into LCM. So we'll go to group types, we'll add a group type. We called it super clever like TAM Lab 075 group type. Then we'll go over to environment. We'll make a T0, I just paste it. We'll call this one group, did I spell that? G-R-O-U-P 1. It'll be of group type T0 or TAM Lab 075 group type. Again, it will contain virtual machines. The object name will contain, let's see, TC11CLI-1. There's just a batch of VMs that were created that match that, that naming convention. So we'll make two groups again, just for reference here. We'll call this one group 2. And it has virtual machines in it. Name contains 11CLI-2. Yeah, about 10 VMs or so. That looks right. And then we'll preview, make sure it's working the way we'd think. That looks good. Let's sort this again. I did a couple things I don't like doing here. I like to check this box to keep group membership up to date. That way, if I create more VMs that match that naming convention or delete some, the group membership stays up to date, and that process runs every 20 minutes. Otherwise, I get stale data in there. And so I just like checking that box, and I forgot. I may have forgot on one of the other groups that we created as well, but no fear, that's easily fixed. So the next step is, what do we need to do to get our dashboard moved from vROps instance 1 to vROps instance 2? And so there's a couple ways we can do that, right? We could just go into vROps and we could, manage our dashboards. We could go find this dashboard and we could export it. We could import it and we'd be done. But that's not what we're demoing today, right? We're going to demo Lifecycle Manager and how it can manage content for us. But one of the other things we want to do is take that content and check it into source code repository. And so in this case, we'll be using GitLab. We'll log into LCM first, and we'll kind of go up here to this main page, right? So LCM, I guess the first use case that is probably most common to folks is using the lifecycle operations. This is what you would use if you're going to deploy a new vROps instance or a VRA instance or something like that. So in this case, I have a couple environments that I've created along the way. This home lab instance is the one that has our source vROps instance. And then this other one that only has vROps in it, that's going to be our destination vROps instance. And so they both happen to be in here simply because, in this case, I had vROps already and I imported it into this home lab. And then for purposes of this demo, I created a separate vROps instance, and I had LCM take care of doing that for me. So they were both already in here. To manage content, you do not actually have to use LCM. You can just, or you don't have to use the lifecycle capabilities. You can just add individual endpoints that you want to manage content for. But if you're already managing the lifecycle of those appliances with LCM, it does make things a little bit easier because the endpoints are already created for you. So we'll toggle back over here and we'll go look at content management. And so, like I mentioned, these vROps instances that are in here were already created just because I'm using the lifecycle functionality. So the endpoint was already in this list. I did have to do a couple things to edit that up. The first one would be this source vROps instance. I came in here to edit the settings. All of this stuff was fine, so I just skipped over to next. And that displays these policy settings. And so handful of boxes that we can select. But in this case, I only selected allow content to be captured from this endpoint. Now, this is my source vROps environment, and so I'm going to use LCM to capture content from here. So that's the only box that I checked. So this becomes my source. I could also, check some of these other boxes, depending on what I want to do. If this is going to be a production endpoint where I want to send stuff, I could check that box. But for my purposes, just to keep it simple and kind of clean, the source environment, I only check this first box. And then likewise over here on the destination environment, I marked it as a production endpoint. Didn't necessarily have to do that. Through part of the workflows, you can actually define content that you've captured as production ready, and you can set it up so that you can only send production ready content to production endpoints. It's probably outside of what we'll have time to do in here. So we can kind of ignore this checkbox. It's not really going to be doing anything for us today. And then we've got a GitLab instance that's mentioned. And so there's actually two things we have to do to get this set up. We start under content settings and source control access. And we have to enter our source control server. And in this case, it's GitLab. We're not using HTTPS, so we actually have to specifically call out that it's HTTP and the port is 80. If you have HTTPS set up, you don't have to mention any of that port or protocol stuff. It just assumes HTTPS. But for purposes of this demo, I did not set up SSL. So we'll go ahead and jump over to GitLab while we're kind of in here looking at the source control server. We'll edit this entry here. So we've got, it's GitLab, we've got our server name listed. We need an access key. So I did want to take a second to kind of walk through the dots that get created in GitLab to make this work. So right now we're logged in as the root user that gets created when you install GitLab. This is the community edition, so it's only exists in life because of this demo. So what we're going to do is create a group. When we go set up in LCM this content endpoint, it is expecting the name format of group/project. So we're going to create a group. We'll just call it group 1. And we won't change anything else. We'll just call it group 1. We'll be super simple here. Then we'll create a project and we'll call it project 1. Again, not super creative, but we will throw a README in there. Why not? We'll create our project. And so now we have group 1 that contains project 1. So we can kind of follow the breadcrumbs here. Group 1, project 1, details. The only thing that we have right now is a README. So we're all set from that perspective. We have a place to put our source controlled content. Now, back on LCM, before we kind of browsed away from that, LCM was asking us for an access token, or let's see what the word specifically it used was access key. So in GitLab, that's called an access token. So we go find that by clicking here on the user, going to settings, and then there is a access tokens section. So we will create a access token. Might as well call it TAM Lab 075. We won't set it to expire. The vRealize Suite LCM product actually calls out that you want to have all of these permissions when you create this account. I'm not sure if those are all required or if we could get by with a subset of these permissions. I didn't actually test that out. I'm assuming that LCM can actually do more with GitLab than what we're doing in the demo. So I just went ahead and checked all the boxes. So we'll go ahead and take this access token. We'll put it in our clipboard. We'll come over here and paste it in. And we'll hit submit. So now we've got our access token created. It's got all of the permissions. So if we run into a problem, it's unlikely to be permissions related. We'll paste this down just for future reference in case we need that token again. All right, so I think we're all set over here, right? So we'll go back to our group 1 and project 1. We'll need to come back here. We'll look at branches, right? We only have the one kind of master branch. There's nothing in it right now except this README file. All right, so back to LCM. When we're looking at endpoints, let's edit this source control endpoint as well. So we've got a name, we've got our server. We'll use the master branch, but here it's asking us what repository we want to use. And it says LCM vROps right now, but this is the project and group that we just set up. So we'll say group 1/project 1. And that follows, kind of what we see here in this header, right? Group 1/project 1. This information is what it's looking for. So we'll paste that in, we'll test our connection. It says everything's good. So we'll hit next. The only policy setting we have here is to enable code review. And I've got that checked, and we'll run into that here in a second. We could just uncheck this. Anything that comes out of our source environment just goes straight to source control, and it is in that master branch all ready to go. Enabling code review actually gives us a little bit of a safety measure for someone to actually need to go into GitLab and do a review process. And so we'll leave that checked, and we'll stumble through that here in a minute. All right, so that's the end of that workflow. We'll hit submit, so we're all set there. And so everything is set up here from a content standpoint, right? We've got a source vROps environment, a destination vROps environment, and we have a source code repository that we can use along the way if we want to. All right, so we'll flip over here to content. So this next part is about actually picking what content that we want LCM to do something about. And so when we say add content, we see a handful of content endpoint types. vCenter server shows up. This one, I think, has quite a bit of potential. You can actually use roughly the same workflow we're going to show off here to manage vSphere templates and customization specifications. So if you have a lot of different vCenters and you want to have the same Windows Server customization spec available in all of them, you could actually use this to clone those from environment to environment. Works with VRA, VRO, and the two that we're going to focus on in this demo are vROps and source control. So we're going to go to vROps, and we are going to, this again is coming from our source environment. We want to capture that dashboard we created. And then we can select an additional action. We don't have to, but for this demo, we're going to. The two options we have are check-in and deploy. So check-in would be used for source control, and deploy would be used for going directly to that destination vROps environment without going through source control. For our purposes, I think going into source control is going to be the best route because it's going to let us demo more features, right? So that's what we're going to do here. So it's asking us which endpoint we want to capture from, and I only see one vROps instance. And as we saw before on the endpoints, we actually have two different vROps instances available. The reason only one appears is because we only marked one of them for capture. If we had marked both of them for capture, they would both appear. But to keep things simple, we've just got that one source environment, and that's where we're going to capture from. So now it shows us a list of stuff that it can capture from that source environment. So we can get things like alerts and reports and views. And as you recall, we actually did create a view, but we're going to just drill into dashboards. And specifically, we're going to look for this TAM Lab 075 dashboard 1 that we created. And that's all we're going to select. It does contain a view. We'll see that here in just a second, because there is a checkbox to include all dependencies. So this would be that trend view that we created that's inside of this dashboard. LCM is going to pick up on that and include it as a dependency for us. We can also mark it as production ready because we like that dashboard so much. We know that it's going to be the final shipping dashboard. And we'll just put a comment in here. It's required. We'll call it test because we're creative. Now, when we hit next, it's going to have us pick kind of that next step, right? We told it that in addition to doing a capture, we also wanted it to do an additional action, and that action was to check in. So when we get to this next screen, the only endpoint we see is our source control, our GitLab instance. And group 1, project 1, master branch. So we've got all of that kind of set. So we'll go ahead, we'll say test. Again, it gives us kind of a final review thing. It shows us that it's going to pull in just that one dashboard, and it's going to include all of the dependencies. All right, so it's got that dashboard that it's going to go collect for us. It says that it created this response number 50. And we'll keep that in mind because we'll see 50 here again in a second. And we see that the dashboard is in this view. When the workflows are done to actually bring the information into LCM, this dot will turn green. It's not green just yet, so if we want, we can actually drill in and look at the execution. Still says it's in progress. It's still doing its thing, still trying to capture. So we can sit here and watch it and hit refresh every few seconds. I've done this demo a couple times. I find that when I'm testing it and nobody's watching, it goes super fast. When someone else is watching, it goes super slow, which is, I don't know how that actually works out, but it may take a minute here before this actually completes. All right, so status of the capture is complete. And the second part of that was the check-in. It's complete as well. So we've got our capture, we've got our check-in. We should be all set. So LCM has done what we asked it to do. It captured content from our source vROps environment, and it checked it into source control. So if we want, when we go into this dashboard, we can see that originally we only picked the dashboard we wanted, but it also has that view that we created as well. And that's just because it's a dependency, and LCM pulled it in as well. We can drill into this dashboard, and from here we can deploy it directly to a different vROps instance. We could check it in again, which doesn't necessarily make sense. We could deploy it to like a test vROps instance to make sure it's working, or we could delete it. What we're actually going to do is just kind of go back here to this content section, and one of the use cases I mentioned was corporate IT made a dashboard, manufacturing wants to use it. In a scenario like that, it's possible that the manufacturing team has their own LCM and they manage their own vROps instances and their own vCenters and all of that kind of stuff. So it's quite possible that they don't actually have both vROps instances in the same LCM. So we're actually going to walk through this adding content slightly different, just to kind of simulate what it would look like if we had two different LCMs. So we're going to add our content again, but this time instead of capturing from vROps, we're going to capture from source control. And we will capture what's in source control, and we will deploy it to a vROps instance. Again, we only see one item in this capture endpoint because we only have one source control location captured. When we go this way, we actually see a list of all of the object types that LCM is capable of capturing. Whereas if you remember before, it only showed us the vROps object types because we were capturing from vROps. These are all of the items that could potentially be inside of that source code repository. So it's showing us everything. As you recall, there's just a dashboard that we want, and it was called TAM Lab 075 something. So we type that in, and unfortunately, we don't see anything. Now, the reason for that, and I did this on purpose, was when we captured from our source vROps, or when we defined our source code repository, we checked that box that said require code review. And so if you follow the tasks we have done so far, we check something into source code repository, but we haven't actually done anything to review that code, which is why it doesn't appear here. So if we toggle back over to our Git instance, and we'll just refresh this page, we'll notice that there's a new branch that's been created. And this new branch has request 50 in it. As you recall, when we did that capture, there was the pop-up that came up and said, request 50 had been submitted. This 50 maps to that 50. So this is the branch that was created when we did our capture and check-in into GitLab. So as part of this, it created a new branch. If we go look at that branch, we're going to see our dashboards and our views. We can actually go look at the JSON that was created. And if we browse through here, we'll see things like the object list, is based off of TAM Lab 075 group type. This is hard coded in that dashboard. If if we would have done a similar exercise with that first dashboard that I had pre-created that didn't work in the destination environment, we would have actually seen individual VM names, and that's part of why it wouldn't have worked in that destination environment. So we've got this branch that's got all of our captured content in it. It's got our dashboards. It's got our view that's a dependency. But we also have a merge request that's in this GitLab instance. Again, request 50 being that ID from when we did the capture and check-in. We can look at this and we can approve, and then we can merge our request. We'll leave that box that says delete source branch. We'll leave that checked as well. So we toggle back over to group one, project one's repository. We no longer have a separate branch. Everything's been committed to master. We've done our code review. We trusted this dashboard and we've got it committed to this master branch. So now if we come back over here to LCM and we get our latest content and we're searching for TAM Lab 075 dashboards, we now see one. And that's, we completed our code review, and that's why it appears now and it didn't appear before. All right, so we'll say done. We've selected the content that we want to deploy. We'll say that we want to include all of the dependencies as well. So we want this job to actually pull that view in from the Git instance as well. We'll mark it as production ready, and we'll just use the word test again because we're super crafty. So then we're going to pick the endpoints that we want to release to. And I'm going to pick specifically this destination vROps instance that we were looking at. And I'll tell it to stop if there's any failures. Once we get all of that filled in, we need to check this check content version compatibility. So it's just making sure that the version that's in source control will work in that destination vROps environment, kind of a validation on the dashboard itself. And it checks out that it's compatible so that that dashboard that's in our source control will work in that destination environment. All right, so we click next, we get kind of a final summary here, and then we'll hit submit. And so again, we've got response number 52 that's happening. We can come in here to this content pipeline. Green dots are things that were completed successfully. Red dots are things that failed. This green dot was the previous capture that we did and check in. And then this is the one that's currently executing, right? It's an empty circle because it's still trying to figure out if it was going to be successful or not. And by the time we get to it, the capture is already done. So it's pulled the information out of our source control. But this deploy is not done yet. So we'll give it a minute to do its thing. We'll just keep hitting refresh until it turns green as well. And there we go. So we say that the deploy to that destination vROps instance is complete as well. All right, so if we toggle over here, I don't see TAM Lab 075 in my dashboard list, so I'll hit refresh. And there we go. We've got dashboard 1. And in this case, we have group 1 and group 2, right? We don't see domain controller and radius because when we created groups in this environment, we used different names. But when we pick one of these groups, it populates our 2 widgets, just like we would expect. And we told it we wanted the legend enabled, so these would be the different colored bars that are different colored lines that would be used for each of those objects. So covering a handful of things, right? We did a dashboard creation. We weren't super extensive in that, right? This is a pretty basic dashboard as far as they go, but the real kind of key concept there was to create that custom group type and then create groups that map to it. Once we had a group that was portable, we captured it with vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager and checked it into source control. Then we went into source control, did code review, approved our changes that we had checked in. And then we kind of went the long way about recapturing from source control and deploying to a different vROps instance to kind of simulate that disconnected approach. We could have done that with a few less clicks by going into our content, the dashboard itself, and from here just doing a simple deploy of that dashboard as opposed to recapturing it from source control. But I think it made sense to do that kind of extra step just to show one more potential way that you could leverage this. And then we went, last we went to that destination vROps instance and ensured that the dashboard displays as expected, and this dependent view that we created also came along for the ride. And we can see that in here. If we go look at manage views, we should also see our TAM Lab 075 trend view that we created also came along as part of that LCM exercise. All right, so didn't leave a whole lot of time for Q&A, but we've got a couple minutes here, and I've got time after the top of the hour if there are any questions.
Brian, I want to compliment you. I think you did a great job, and this is awesome. At least from my perspective, I'm definitely wanted to congratulate you. I thought it was a great session. What do you guys think out there?
Yeah, this was good, Brian. Hey, Brian, I got a quick question. When people put custom costing for their hardware, and if you do the cost report, will it bring in that custom costing as along with the report?
That's a great question. I'm going to say no. I don't know the actual answer, but the reason I say no is like when you go in to do the cost drivers and whatnot. So I did set up some cost stuff in here. You can actually drill in and you can do it like per specific data center. And like when you're looking at hardware, you can actually like drill into specific pieces of compute and say like each one of them costs something different. And on that destination environment, you're going to have different objects potentially. So I would assume that these cost drivers don't come along for the ride, if that makes sense.
Okay. And there's no way to import those if they do have like hardware in each data center?
Let's see here. When we go and add content, I don't recall looking for it. It's a great question. It would be it'd be something super nice to see. Like one thing, and I guess I didn't touch on this specifically, but like that custom group type that we created, like there is no mechanism for LCM to move those for you. And part of the reason is because the objects that they would contain and whatnot need to, potentially be created in that destination environment. And, the inventory is actually managed in that destination environment. And so unfortunately, I think cost drivers would probably kind of shake out the same way. I don't actually see them listed out here, but that does seem like a fantastic feature request. If a customer has like hardware or more specifically would want to manage some of that hardware and costing information through a source control repository so that they can see when it's been changed and that sort of thing. I think that'd be fantastic.
All right, thank you.
Brian, I want to thank you once again. Thank you guys for joining, and we'll see you on the next TAM Lab.
Thanks.
Thank you.